I was at the author showcase thing, and Andy Cagnetta, is he here, Transworld guy, somewhere? He's like, "You're the grandfather of this of this industry." I'm like, "Grandfather? I'm not sure that's a compliment." But in any event, I appreciate Paige's nice warm introduction, and thank you for having me back to EPI. I'm excited to be with you. My session has a unique name. It's called Inside the Mind of an Entrepreneur. And as Paige was saying, I think if your goal is to get them to act and take action on your advice, I think knowing what motivates them, what their behaviors are, what their wishes and aspirations are, I think is a key part of what is required. And it's something that I personally spent a lot of time thinking about. I'm embarrassed to tell you that I started in 1997 trying to get inside the mind of an entrepreneur. 1997, I started this company called Warrillow, and it had a very creative name. It was my surname, and our promise in the marketplace was helping large enterprise organizations, big Fortune 500 companies, market to small business owners. Right, so very similar to what you're all trying to do is to get inside the head of an entrepreneur. These were big companies trying to get inside the head of small companies. And so we did work with all the big banks, so Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, this is how old I am, Wachovia, remember those guys? All these guys, we'd help them to reach inside the head of an entrepreneur. And I remember my first sort of moment where I figured that we'd finally made it as a company. I had an interview or a conversation with, a pitch, if you will, with a woman named Jo Lawson. Jo, at the time, was the head of small business marketing globally for Apple. It's at 1 Cupertino Way, which is like the old headquarters of Apple. And I went into the boardroom, and in walks Jo, confident woman with a book under her arm. And I noticed the book was my first book called Drilling for Gold, which is before Built to Sell. It was about how do you reach inside the head of an entrepreneur and get inside kind of so you can market to them better. And here's Jo, and as we're having this conversation, she sits down and we're talking, and she kind of starts leafing through my book, and I can see she's underlined certain passages. And she's got little sticky notes, and I realized at that moment that, hey, we maybe made it as a company. We've actually sort of achieved something. If the world's largest company is sort of paying attention to what's inside the mind of an entrepreneur, that was pretty cool. That was sort of the moment for me where I figured this company was going to succeed. We built it up, 2002 or so, we probably had about $6 million in revenue, 25% EBITDA margins, probably very similar to a lot of the business owners that you work with. And I decided I wanted to sell that company. And I went to a guy named Perry Miele, who's an M&A professional, probably some M&A professionals in the room. And I said, what do you think it's worth? And I walked in there with sort of a Cheshire cat grin. I was kind of waiting for the answer, right? Rubbing my hands together, thinking, can't wait to hear this number, and all these great clients. And he says, well, before I answer that question, John, let me ask you a couple of questions. I said, shoot. He says, okay, you're a research business, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, who does the research? And I was like, well, I'm involved. I mean, it's Bank of America. I've got to go do some of that research. And he's like, okay, nope. Well, who does the selling? And I'm like, my name's on the door, Perry. I got to do some of the selling, right? And he's like, okay, sure. Let me get this straight. So you got a research company, you do the research, and you do the selling. And I'm like, yeah, I guess you could put it that way. And he's like, well, I can't sell your company. There's nothing here to sell. It's worthless. And I can tell you, I know a lot of you as CEPAs have had to have that conversation with a client of yours. You've had to tell a business owner their business is not worth what they thought it was. I'm sure you've had to give them that hard medicine. It is a tough pill to take as a business owner to hear that. But Perry gave me the news straight up. And I walked out of that meeting about this tall, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut, realizing that I'd been made basically every mistake in the book, that I'd assumed that just because we had a great client list and lots of EBITDA, that somehow that would be what acquirers would care about. And so I went back to Perry a couple of weeks later, and I said, look, I listened to your story. I get it. I understand. I made a bunch of mistakes. Can you help me? And we worked together over the next couple of years informally. This is pre-CEPA. He was not a CEPA. He would have been today, but this is before that. And he helped me. He said, you've got to get out of the sell-do stuff, right? You got to move to a subscription business model. Because the likes of Bloomberg and Forrester were out there at the time. So we moved from transactions to subscriptions. That had two benefits. Number one, it created a positive cash flow cycle because people pay for subscriptions up front. Number two, it gave us recurring revenue. And you know that that's a huge part of the value acceleration methodology, right? Creating recurring revenue. So we did that. Got somebody else doing some of the selling. We got someone else doing the research. We got standard operating procedures. I mean, all the stuff you do in the value acceleration methodology, right? Like all that stuff we did. And over time, it worked. We got that business ready to go to market, and Perry sold it to Gartner Group, which is a New York Stock Exchange listed company. So it has a happy ending story. But I wanted to kind of share that off the top for two reasons. Number one, I wanted you to know that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this topic today, inside the mind of an entrepreneur. We've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world trying to help them understand what makes business owners tick. But number two, and probably more importantly, I wanted to share that story out of the gate because I think what you do as CEPAs is life-changing for the owners that you work with. You may not hear that every day from the owners that you work with, but I can tell you firsthand, I don't think I'd be on this stage today if it weren't for someone like you. If it weren't for Perry giving me my medicine straight up and saying, hey, it's not worth what you think it is, but there's some things you can do to make it worth what you want it to be if you take my advice. So I think what you do is yeoman's work. It is a calling, I think, and for many of you, rather than an occupation. And so first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Give yourselves a round of applause. So thank you for what you do. I think it's amazing. Yeah, I think it's really amazing. Paige mentioned I've written a couple of books after that process. A couple of years went by, and I wrote a book called Built to Sell, trying to, I guess, codify some of the things I learned from Perry and other advisors along the way. I put that into a book, came out in 2011. The Automatic Customer is about recurring revenue, one of the kind of key ingredients to making a business valuable, as I learned. And then The Art of Selling Your Business in 2021. And I guess you might look at these three and say, well, what do they have in common? What's the common through line? And I think what I would tell you is the goal, or my goal in writing them, was really to level the playing field for business owners as they approach their exit. I think right now in the marketplace, owners are bringing a knife to a gunfight. I think owners are bringing a knife to a gunfight when it comes to selling their business today. They're really looking at three people across the negotiating table when they get into a discussion about their business. Number one is a private equity group. Nothing against private equity groups, but understand the business model, right? So their business is to buy low, sell high, right? Using financial engineering, lots of debt, lots of negotiation hacks like retrading and strategic pacing to effectively buy your client's business for as little money as possible, tart it up, and sell it 5 or 7 years later. Right? So that's number one, person on the other side negotiating. Or they might be negotiating with a corporate development person. So this is a big company executive whose job, training, life, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, is buying companies. Not something most of the business owners you work with are used to dealing with, right? That's not their preoccupation. The third type of person is an ETA buyer. Everybody heard of ETA? It's probably something you've kind of come across recently. Most of the big MBA schools, most of the big business schools, MBA programs are offering ETA courses now. You can get an MBA, a big course like Cornell and Stanford and Harvard, about how to buy a business. I had the two guys from Harvard who started their program about 15 years ago, Rick and Royce, on my podcast a couple weeks ago. And I said, kind of walk me through the way you teach your young students how to do this. How do you get these kids to buy a business? Especially when they don't have any money. They probably just got student debt. Like, how does this all work? And they said, it's kind of easy. They go out and source a deal, right, which is parlance for finding a business owner who wants to sell, right? And they get them in an LOI. And then once they're in an LOI, they have a no-shop clause in the LOI, so they got some time. And then they've got some, structure. They go try to find financing. I said, what do you mean? They don't have financing? He said, no, they get the LOI in place first, and then they go find the financing. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. And he's like, no, it takes a while to get the financing. I said, how long would it take an ETA buyer to do that? He said, it takes on average 9 months to go from LOI to close. 9 months where your client misses 1 month of revenue and they retrade. 9 months during which their negotiating leverage is going down and down and down. That's the landscape of people right now that your clients are selling into. They're bringing a knife to a gunfight. And so our goal in everything that we do is try to leveling this playing field. And that's what we do in the books. It's what we do at Value Builder. And we have obviously a great group of advisors, many of whom are in the room today, that help us on that mission. We license our platform to advisors. And I was talking to Scott before, and I was saying, like, what would be most valuable to the audience? And he said, you know, if you could analyze all the data that you get from Value Builder, that might be kind of cool for our audience to look at. If you could analyze sort of trends and behaviors and then share that back with our audience in the context of like what's inside their mind, that might be super helpful. I said, sure. So to give you a sense of the context, I'm giving 8 insights today that I think every CEPA needs to know about the small business market. So I'm going to kind of walk you through these 8 things. Before I do that, I'll just describe how we get the data. There's sort of 3 major components to Value Builder. The first is our assessments. We do the 3 legs of the stool like Chris Snyder kind of trains. We've got a personal readiness to exit survey, a business readiness to exit, and a financial readiness to exit survey. That's our assessments piece. And we've had 80,000 business owners complete that survey. So that's a big data set that we analyzed. The second is our grow tools, where you can help a client improve their value. And the third is our nurture cycle. And nurture cycle is content, usually case studies of business owners who have sold, that we allow you to white label and push to your audience of business owners. We have 140,000 business owners who get our nurture cycle emails through 1,100 advisors who send it to them. Now, we get to press send on all those emails, and we get all the data back about who opened them, who clicked on them, what they look like, et cetera. And so today, I brought to you basically a giant spreadsheet of all of the analytics of that data set. 80,000 business owners have completed the Value Builder questionnaire, and 140,000 business owners each week who get an email from us. And we've looked at open rates, click rates, and we've diagnosed it all by age group. And so we're trying to understand both, A, what's inside the mind of an entrepreneur, but B, are there differences between millennials, Gen X, and boomers? And so that's the session that I want to walk you through now. And again, the goal is so that you can get owners to act, right, on this important topic of exit planning. You have the insight, the fears, the concerns that business owners have to get business owners to act. That's my goal. 8 insights. I'm going to start with one that you could probably categorize under a kind of Occam's razor. The old, like, the most obvious thing is oftentimes the most obvious answer, which is that age drives exit timeline, right? So again, 3 different age cohorts I've analyzed today. Millennials are age 28 to 43 today. Gen Xers, the Gen X generation is the one I'm in, are age 44 to 59. And then boomers. And as I walk you through this data, I'm going to each time start in the same sequential order. I'll share with you the millennials data, then we'll go to Gen X, and I'll finally reveal the boomers data. And we'll talk about it as we go. Again, under the most obvious sort of category of insights, but I think one that we sometimes forget is that the length of time an owner plans to stay in their business is directly related to the age of the owner, right? So we ask a question on the Value Builder questionnaire, how many years do you plan to continue operating your business? Pretty straightforward question. Millennials tell us they're in it for another 12 years. Boomers tell us they're in it for 9.5 years. Excuse me, Gen X tells us they're in for 9.5 years, and boomers tell us they're in for 5. The people that are most likely open to the trigger event conversation are going to be boomers who are closer to age of wanting to get out. I know that sounds like a simple insight, but it's one I think we don't want to forget as we go, right? The older they are, the closer they are to having this conversation. The second insight I'll share is that the older they are, the more money they have to invest with you. Again, how do we know that? Well, for us, we look at cash flow. On the Value Builder questionnaire we do profitability, we look at EBITDA, we also look at cash flow. Because cash flow, you can't hide from cash flow, right? It's either in the bank or it's not. And the question that we use is as follows. Please select which of the following statements best describes your cash needs. Now, I know at the back it's going to be hard to read, so what I'll do for all these slides, I'll do the exact same thing for all the slides. I'm going to walk down top to bottom the potential responses. So I'll just read them to you. So don't worry if you can't read them, it's okay, I'll just read them to you. So this is millennials data, and then we'll look at Gen X, and then I'll finish with boomers. Among millennials, 9% of them say that we regularly raise or borrow money. Fully another 22% say they occasionally raise or borrow money. So these you can think of as your cash-hungry businesses, right? So about a third of millennials say they're just on the hamster wheel. 45% say that we keep excess cash in a rainy day fund. These are the businesses that have some retained earnings in their bank account. And about 15% say they regularly distribute cash to their shareholders. Okay, so that's the landscape among millennials. If we then layer in Gen X, you can see that the same trends basically hold true, but Gen X are a little more likely to have retained earnings and a little more likely to be shooting cash out to shareholders. And then we look at boomers, the same trend holds true. Even more likely to have a rainy day fund, and even less likely to be cash thirsty. What does that mean for you? Well, obviously it means that boomers are going to have the retained earnings that if you're a financial advisor need to be invested, or if you're a value growth consultant, they have the money to afford what it is that you offer. By contrast, millennials, although an attractive segment for a lot of people, are probably going to be more cash thirsty and might balk a little bit at your fees, just statistically. And as I take you through this data, know that we're talking about broad averages, right? So we can all talk about millennials that you know that spit out tons of cash, or boomers that are super thirsty for cash. We're talking about averages, so keep that in mind as I walk you through this data. One of the big debates, I think, that we had going into this research, and I certainly hear in the kind of hallways and the buzz in this meeting, is what's boomers' exit intent? Like, what are their goals and how are they different than millennials as it relates to how they plan to exit? Because, of course, there's lots of ways you can exit, right? You can exit boots first, as we all have heard before. You can exit to your family members. You can do an ESOP. You can do management buy. Like, all those things are possible, right? And I think there's a bit of a stereotype that boomers are more likely to want to pass their business to their kids, and millennials are more likely to hit the bid and sell to a third party. Let's look at the data that we've analyzed. First, I'll start with millennials, okay? The question is, on the survey, which of the following best describes your long-term goal for your business? I plan to, at the very top, shut down my business. 1% of millennials said that. 8% said other, 15% said transition to my kids. 15% said transition to my kids. 27%, around 1 in 4, said, I plan to transition to my next generation of managers. Think of these as the law firm model where you bring up the next generation of partners over time, management buyout, et cetera. And about 49% say, sell my business to a third party. That's the millennials data. Let's look at Gen X. Again, same basic pattern, but a little more likely to sell to a third party, and a little less likely to do a transition to their kids. Now remember, when I sat down to do the analysis on this data, I thought, well, boomers are going to way over-index on passing the business to their kids. The opposite is true. Boomers want to sell their business to a third party. And are actually less likely to want to do a family transition or a management buyout. I'd bet you that's a surprise for a lot of people in the room, right? But if you've actually worked with a lot of boomer business owners, they've known their kids for a while, right? They know little Johnny or little Susie's probably not ready to take over, and so they've got the stark reality that maybe transitioning to the business isn't what it's used to. Whereas millennials are still kind of in the halcyon days of thinking, oh, it'd be great if my kids took it over. That's the reality. That's the data. What are the biggest fears owners have? Paige talked about the idea of, for you to resonate, get business owners to act. I think it helps to know what their biggest fears are. Like, what is their deep-seated concern about investing in exit planning, about having an exit event, a liquidity event? Like, what is it that is the blocker that gets people to act? So we asked that exact question, which is, which of the following best describes your biggest fear when it comes to selling your business? Which of the following best describes your biggest fear when it comes to selling your business? This is the Millennials data. 7%, very top, say that no one can run things as well as I can. You've heard that before. 7% said, I don't think I'll have anything to do in retirement. 11% said disappointing my employees. About a quarter said that my legacy I have built will not continue. We talk a lot about legacy in this room, so about a quarter are saying that's their biggest concern. And half of them say, not getting the value I think my business is worth. Again, that's the Millennials data. Let's look at Gen X. Even more likely to say their biggest concern is not getting the value they think their business is worth. And then we look at Boomers. My assumption in doing this analysis that Boomers would over-index on that their legacy would become something that will be gone in the next generation of ownership. In fact, the opposite is true. They're less likely to be preoccupied with that, more likely to worry about leaving money on the table. I'm reminded of Sully. Do you remember Sully, the movie? The guy who landed the airplane on the Hudson River. They made a book about it. They made a movie about it. Sully was one of these guys who had done everything there was to do in an aircraft. He went to, you may not know this, but he actually went to flight academy in the military. He was a military pilot before he was a commercial pilot. He was a military trainer, so he trained young military officers how to fly. Then he transitioned to commercial air flight and spent 30 years in US Airlines, both as a commercial pilot, but also training young pilots. So you couldn't find a pilot more qualified to fly a 737 than, he was the guy, right? Right age, late 50s, he'd done everything there is to do in an airplane, taught all kinds of other people how to do all kinds of things in an airplane. Yet he'd never landed an airplane on the Hudson River. 155 lives in his hands at the end of the yoke, and he'd never done it. And that, my friends, is exactly how the business owners you work with feeling about exiting their company. They know everything there is to know about their widget, the service they provide, the industry they're in. They built marketing plans, sales plans, they've hired employees, fired employees. They know all of that stuff, right? Just like Sully knew everything there was to do. He knew what every button did on the 737. Yet he'd never had the chance to land an airplane on the Hudson River. And that's exactly the same feeling that your clients feel. And it's an interesting cocktail of ego to negotiate, right? Because they're bullheaded, smart, street smart, hard-nosed entrepreneurs who feel like they know it all, right? And at the same time are desperately vulnerable about how to exit their business on top. That's the type of person that you're dealing with. And their biggest fear is not leaving a legacy. It's not that they're going to disappoint their employees. Their biggest fear is an unforced error, is leaving money on the table, is not getting the value they think their business is worth. I'm not discounting the other things. They do worry about their legacy. They do worry about their employees. But when push comes to shove, the number one fear is, I don't want to leave money on the table. I mentioned that we do this email once a week, 52 emails, one per week. 1,100 advisors send it to 140,000 business owners. It's 5.2 million messages a year. I did the math. This is one of the emails that we send. Your logo appears where you see our logo, so just disregard that. The subject header of the one in question is why Alex Bean was unhappy after selling Divvy for $2.5 billion. Regret around selling your business. And where did it rank among the 52 emails we sent last year? It was number one. Highest open rate of all of the emails we sent last year had to do about the regret business owners feel about leaving money on the table. Insight number 5. I hate to say it for any of the millennials in this room. I'm not one, so I get to make this joke or make this comment. I think millennials are a little more materialistic than other generations. And I'll tell you why. I think I've got the data to kind of back it up. The first is a question we ask on the Value Builder questionnaire, which is, which of the following best describes your definition of someone who's wealthy? Which of the following best describes your definition of someone who's wealthy? And here, we force them into a decision, right? We don't give them an other option and allow them to kind of populate their own definition. We say, which of the following best describes, so you got to pick one of these 3. We do that for a reason. We want to know, push comes to shove, at the fork in the road, which is their closest definition of wealthy. Okay, and again, this is the millennials data. First answer at the top. 1 in 5 millennials say it's an individual with at least $10 million of investable assets. Second answer, 35% of the time millennials answered this way. Having enough money saved up to cover your monthly lifestyle expenses for the rest of your life. That's my definition of someone who's wealthy. 46% of the time, the most common answer was having enough money to do whatever you want, whenever you want to. So that's how millennials sort of think about wealth and their definition of wealth. Let's look at Gen X. Same general trends hold true, but I want you to look at the top number. Now it's down to 14% who are putting a hard number on wealth. And the ones that are more likely to talk about what they can do with that money, the experience they want to have with that money, or the feeling they want that money to give them, are starting to over-index. And if we look at the boomer market, the trend just becomes more pronounced. In fact, boomers are almost half as likely to say that it's an artificial number, and much more likely to say wealth is doing whatever you want, whenever you want to. And again, when Paige talked about this idea of like getting inside the head of an entrepreneur, getting them to act, getting them to take what you do seriously and motivated to move forward on some of the exit planning stuff that you're working with them on, understanding what their aspirations are, I think is important. And again, boomers tell us that it's this idea of having enough to do whatever they want, whenever they want to, more so than an artificial number. Now, that was my first clue that millennials may be just a little bit more kind of materialistic than the rest of the market. And then I looked at the email database. So again, 52 emails, we looked at the open rate, right? Which is a proxy for like, are they interested in the topic effectively, right? And we sent this email with the subject header, after the deal, quote, flying private. Now, most of the nurture cycle emails that we do are case studies of business owners who have sold their company. Like that's most of them, right? But increasingly, we're getting kind of interest, comments, requests for like, what is life like after the deal? I know a lot of the sessions actually in this room and the breakouts have been around this concept of like redefining their life after selling, purpose, and all those kind of big issues that come up after the sale. One of the practical issues is around money and how to spend it, and one of the aspirations a lot of business owners have is flying private. So we did an email about it. We did a whole interview with a guy who talks a lot about flying private. And I was frankly kind of a little nervous hitting send on this email because I was like, I don't know, this is going to be an interesting one. I don't know if it's going to get a lot of back. Well, let's see. So 52 emails, it was a stinker. Bottom quartile performance, 39 out of 52. Like, kind of a stinker, right? Bottom quartile, overall. Then we cut the data by age. It was the #1 email opened by millennials. Hands up who's a millennial in the room. No, I'm kidding. I find it interesting that that was the #1 email opened by millennials, and yet it was the 39th out of 52 emails we sent last year. And so you can imagine, just by virtue of the fact that it was #1 among millennials, it was a catastrophic failure among boomers. your industry experience, the ability for you to talk eloquently, casually, freely about their industry gives you the chops to move forward with that business owner. The ability to be able to talk about their industry, the idiosyncrasies, the uniqueness of what they do in their industry really drives business owners' decision making. On the Value Builder questionnaire, we ask, which of the following best describes what you look for in an advisor? Again, the people filling out the Value Builder questionnaire are the business owners, right? They're doing it on their own, right? And we say, which of the following best describes what you look for in an advisor? Again, top to bottom, millennials data first. And here we again push them into one of three answers. Is it A, a track record of helping companies in my city? Like you're the EOS implementer in Denver, I'm in Denver, I want to work with you, right? That's the decision making. That's 7% of the time, right? 41% say it's a track record of helping fast growth companies. Again, millennials data here. And 52% of millennials said it's a track record of helping companies in my industry. Right? So you're the one who knows my industry. That's why I chose you. Okay? That's the millennials data. Let's look at Gen X. And then let's look at boomers. Here again, I want us to make sure we're not losing the forest for the trees. I've spent a lot of time talking about the difference between millennials and boomers and try to accentuate that difference, but I want everybody to see that the number one response from everybody, regardless of age, was, in fact, that they want to work with someone who knows their industry. So that's the kind of big takeaway. But among boomers, who are arguably the ones who can spend money on what you do and also are most motivated to do what you do, they're even more likely to want to know that you understand their industry. And they're more likely to pick you over the next guy or gal because you understand their industry. I was talking to Leslie from RBC in the exhibit hall. I don't know if she's here still. She might have gone home. Leslie was from RBC. They do ESOPs, right? And I was just quizzing her at the booth, saying, like, how do you coach young financial advisors how to differentiate yourself? Because, like, I mean, there's not a lot that make, the RBC wealth guys different than the, Wells Fargo. I mean, you're all kind of selling a commodity, aren't you? And she said, well, no. What I teach my young FAs, financial advisors, to do is pick an industry. I say, go look at the book of your clients and find the 3 clients you like working with most. Find out what industry they're in and ask them to take you to their industry conference and introduce you to a couple of their best friends in their industry. And so one young advisor took her advice, and he decided to go work with scaffolding company owners. Talk about a niche of a niche of a niche, right? Like, these are the guys who you're building a project, home or commercial setting, and they set up that labyrinth of scaffolding, right? They rent the equipment to the trade, and then they go take it all down when it's over. Scaffolding rental companies. And guess what? There's a Scaffolding Conference of America. And they went to this conference. And over the next 20 years, this financial advisor became the scaffolding guy and built an entire book, wealth management book, very lucrative, just business owners who were building and selling a scaffolding company. The fact that you can talk about their industry, the little buzzwords, the tribal language they all use, the fact that a dental practice has a lot of capital expense up front, have to buy the chairs and the lights, and the fact that an HVAC company owner has to worry about inventory and seasonality, that gives you credibility to get to the next conversation. Huge among boomers. This maybe goes in the Occam's razor answer as well, but age also predicts media consumption habits. In other words, how you might want to think about marketing to these business owners depends a little bit on how old a business owner you're looking to market to. I'll say that again. The way to reach these business owners varies based on how old they are, right? Kind of an obvious, but let me give you some data to support that. One of the questions we ask on the Value Builder questionnaire is around how digitally native the business owner is. And the proxy we use for that is, how many followers do you have? Like, if you just added up all the people that follow you on X, that follow your Instagram account, Facebook, TikTok if you use it, connections on LinkedIn, like, what does that database look like? How many followers? Could you estimate that for me? This is the millennials data. About 18% say none, not big social users. 41% say 1 to 1,000. Okay, so the biggest majority of millennials say it's 1 to 1,000. But more than a quarter say 1,000 to 10,000. And fully 10% of millennials say they've got at least 10,000 followers on those social channels. When we look at the Gen X data, it's a little more muted, more likely to say 1 to 1,000, a little less likely to say 10,000 plus. And not surprising, when we look at the boomer data, they're much more likely to say none, and quite a bit less likely to say 10,000 plus. So if your goal is to reach the next generation of entrepreneurs, you've got a mastermind that you want to put folks in for 10 years while you kind of build their value, if you're doing value acceleration stuff and you're not really worried about the exit piece, for sure, millennials through social makes a ton of sense. Tons of LinkedIn publishing, tons of content on Facebook and other platforms, right? But if the goal is to reach boomers who are much closer to an exit, who have the money to spend with you, et cetera, I'm not sure social is, speak English, I am not sure that social would be the place I would start, which led me to the kind of analysis that we wanted to do around email. So we got to thinking, okay, what if we just look at the entire database of email, right, 140,000 business owners, cut them by age, millennial, boomers, Gen X, et cetera, and look at their overall open rate. I wonder if there's a difference, right? Our assumption was probably not a very interesting thing to look at, but let's look at it anyways, right? Well, we found out some interesting trends. 28% was the average open rate among millennials. But among Gen X, my generation, it was all the way up to almost 43% open rates. And I was trying to think about this, like, why would that be such a difference between Gen X and millennials as it relates to email? And then I thought about my own behavior. So I'm 53. So when I was, I came of age in the business world, if you will, in the early 90s. I remember 1993, for some reason, sticks in my head, is when I got my first email address, right? By the mid-90s, that was the medium through which I was communicating. It was this entire revelation of ways to communicate with people was email. For a lot of us who find ourselves in the same age cohort, email is the kind of default technology, right? It's not to say millennials don't use it or boomers don't use it, but we grew up. That's our generation's medium, right? And as a result, you can see it in the data. So again, for those of you who are looking to work with the next generation of people going through an exit, Gen X, I don't think email's dead. It's like video killed the radio star. They talked about social killing email. I don't think it's true. I think email is alive and well, especially among Gen X. Boomers, it flattens out again. Similar, in fact, to millennials. Which maybe begs the question for a lot of you, okay, well, how do I reach boomers? Which takes me to the last of my insights I wanted to share with you, which is that exiting is a team sport. It's something you've heard before, but I'll just back it up with some data. The question we ask is, who would you be most likely to turn to for advice on building the value of your company? And I realize it's very small on the left, so I'll read it from top to bottom, so don't worry if you can't see it. Again, the question is, who would you turn to for advice on building the value of your company? And I want to just underscore the question. It's not who would you turn to for building an ESOP, or who would you turn to for selling your company, or who would you turn to for financial advice after you sold it. That's not the question. The question is who you would turn to for building the value of your company. Remember, their number one fear is leaving money on the table. That's their number one concern, is not getting the value they think their business is worth. So the question is, who would you turn to for building the value of your company, I think is an important question for us to answer. And again, I'll go top to bottom here. 1% of millennials say they would go to an investment advisor. 2% said an exit planner. 3% said a business broker. 4% said a close family member or friend. 6% said a fellow entrepreneur. 7% said an M&A professional or business broker. 36% said a coach or consultant, and 37% said an accountant. If we layer in the Gen X data, basically the same trends hold true with one exception, which is that M&A professionals tend to pop a little bit more. And by the way, for any of you who are kind of doing the math and saying, why doesn't this add up to 100? We allowed business owners in this question to pick all that apply. So if they were picking more than one advisor to go to build the value of their company, they could choose more than one. Okay, so that's why it doesn't add up to 100. If we look at boomers, the same thing is true. They seem a little less likely than others to turn to a coach or consultant, but a little more likely to turn to an M&A professional or business broker, and a little more likely to talk to a fellow entrepreneur. So those of you who do masterminds, those are, that data would be sort of reflected there. So what does this mean for you all? I know we've got a lot of financial advisors in the room and value growth consultants. We've got accountants and M&A professionals. You can see the data. Who are they most likely to turn to? So I know that's why a conference like this is so valuable for a lot of you, and that is that it helps you build your network, and I think it makes a ton of sense. Because if you are a financial advisor or even an exit planner at 2% of the millennials market, you're probably not the first person they're thinking of when it comes to building the value of their company. So what does that mean? Number one, you want centers of influence. You want to have an accountant, coach, consultant, M&A professional in your network so they know about you and the work that you do. I know a lot of you do that already, so that's great. Number two, I think you want to really master this initiating the end game conversation, getting really good at starting the conversation with business owners. Because they're not likely to come to you by default, but if you initiate the conversation, you might be in a position where you can have that conversation with a business owner. So it's a team sport. Let me finish up with sort of a summary of what we've talked about today. First insight that I shared was age drives exit timeline. Again, for a lot of you, you already know that intuitively, right? Your older clients are closer to the end than the beginning, right? Whereas your younger clients are probably a little more hesitant to talk about the exit. But it does bear remembering, obviously, that age has a profound impact on their appetite to do exit planning. Older owners can afford your advice. I can't say it any more simply than that. They have more retained earnings, they have more cash in their business, they have more likelihood to spend money with you and invest money with you if you're a financial advisor. So it does make the older owner entrepreneur market, I think, an attractive one disproportionately. Unlike what I think the stereotype is, boomers want to sell their companies. Right? They want to sell their company. Statistically, are more likely to want to sell their company than to go through a family transition or transition to their kids. That's the same trend across all age cohorts, but it's even more pronounced among boomers. And if we're worried about what their biggest concern is it that they're going to disappoint their employees, or that their legacy is not going to continue? The number one concern among all age cohorts was that they are going to leave money on the table. Remember Sully and landing the plane on the Hudson River. That's the way they feel about this. They don't want an unforced error. And it's even more pronounced among boomers. I hate to say it, but it seems like millennials are a little more kind of materialistic. Maybe it's all the internet wealth porn they get, all the Instagram stuff on my Rolls Royce and my Ferrari. I don't know what it is. Right? But it seems to be affecting their psyche around money. At least it seems that way when we look at the data. Industry is critical, right? Being able to talk your talk, like I'm the scaffolding guy, I'm the HVAC lady, like that helps. That's going to give you enormous credibility when it comes to getting business owners to act. Age predicts media preferences, right? Younger people are more likely to be on LinkedIn. Older business owners are more likely to rely on a referral from a center of influence. And us Gen Xers, we still look at email. And then finally, exiting is a team sport. Making sure that you get lots of business cards leaving here. I know you've been doing that for the last 3 days, and you're probably sick of hearing about it, but networking with people who you can be mutually beneficial referral sources, I think is critical when it comes to nailing this market segment. Let me end with where I began. I wouldn't be standing here, and I mean that in the most sincere way, if it weren't for someone like you. I had a Perry in my life, and most of the business owners you work with have you to count on. I think you oftentimes probably don't get the recognition that you deserve for the work that you do, but your work matters. Your work matters to people like me and the people that you serve. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. It was really my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Amy. Thank you. It was good.
Thank you so much.
You want that guy?
Great job. Yes, I do.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, everybody, all right, so quick reminder in NAG, continuing education is important. Remember to fill them out. They have to be in by 5 o'clock tonight in order to get your credits. And if you are a reporter, that's important. And then you still have time to give to the charity under the donate section. We will be closing out soon. So I don't have a return time. I think we're taking a break. Is that right, you guys? Yeah, 2:30. Thank you very much. It's 1:55. They didn't put it on the slide, and as you can see, I'm blind. So I really appreciate you guys. Thank you for your attention. Okay, look, I helped design the closing session. If you are not catching a flight, would you please, please, please come back for the closing session? I promise it will be worth your time. See you guys soon. Thanks.